Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on from where you join. Welcome to this MERICS event on China's 20th WTO anniversary. Cause for celebration, ? We wait until the participants and audience room is getting filled here virtually, and we'll then get started. We're very much looking forward to this wonderful panel that we are having assembled today here for you. And we'll just wait one more minute until we get started when everyone is in the room. I want to remind you also that the presentation is being recorded today, just to make sure that you have that in mind with and calibrate whatever you want to say in our meeting today. All right, brilliant. Once more, welcome to MERICS. Welcome to this session. My name is Mikko Huotari. I'm Executive Director of the Mercator Institute for China Studies. The timing of this meeting is obviously related to historical developments. 20 years ago, on the 11th of December, China joined the WTO 30 days after the notification period came to a close. It was also historic and somewhat coincidental that the ministerial conference of the WTO MC12 was postponed just a week ago due to the new corona variant outbreak, which is a very sad development, quite understandable at the same time. So with regard to our question today, is it a cause for celebration that we are celebrating that we're having China's 20th anniversary of its WTO participation? And I would not hesitate to say, yes, in many ways it is a cause for celebration, but it's probably cautious celebration. And there's concerns as we look ahead with regard to the future of the global trading system. I think the question at hand really is, to what extent is rulemaking with China possible in the future? And I think this is what is at stake. And I very much look forward to discussing the past and the present and future of the WTO in 1 hour with a fantastic panel, and which I'm going to introduce to you right now. Let me start with Alicia Garcia Herrero, Chief Economist for the Asia Pacific at NATIXIS and Senior Fellow at Bruegel. She has published extensively on economic issues and WTO reforms. Just recently, the elephant in the room of WTO reform, China for CES E4 forum at the E4 Institute. She will be joining us from Malta today, where there's some issues with the connection. So I hope we can bring her on board in just a few minutes. Second in line here in alphabetical order, it is our great honor to welcome Pascal Lamy. He's president of the Paris Peace Forum, former Director General of the WTO from 2005 to 2013. He was also European Commissioner for Trade, and obviously during a period where China joined the WTO and brings extensive knowledge and experience in navigating that accession and the implications of that as we have moved forward. He recently was quoted in the China Daily that China has achieved an A+ score in fulfilling its WTO commitments. At the same time, I'm not sure whether the quote was quoted out of context, but you're also on record by saying that China is probably the biggest challenge for the future of the WTO. So we look forward to hearing from you more about that tension. I'm also very, very pleased to welcome Audrey, former Deputy Assistant USTR, US Trade Representative for China, and you've worked extensively under previous governments on China matters at USTR, but also before becoming of the China Affairs Office, you were a lead negotiator for WTO trade remedy and trade competition negotiations. You litigated WTO dispute settlements cases for the United States. So very much looking forward to your contribution to our debate today. I think it's also not a secret to say that you by heart are a European. So we're specifically enlightened and happy to have you here on board. Next in line, and certainly not the least person here in this room, Joerg Wuttke, President of the European Union Chamber of Commerce. He's Chief Representative of BASF China in Beijing since 1997. And has a unique perspective on China's trade relations and involvement in multilateral organizations from a business perspective. You are the third-term president of the European Union Chamber of Commerce. And recently you said one thing on China and trade, which is, yes, indeed, change through trade has happened. China has changed the European Union quite tremendously and fundamentally in many ways. You said that just yesterday, I think at the Europe Forum in Lucerne. So great to have you on board, Joerg. Thanks for joining today. And with that, I would like to hand over almost immediately to my panelists here, but just in terms of housekeeping and house rules, the event is being recorded. If you encounter any technical problems, please contact us through the chat. I will also open up for questions from the audience. It is we will make this as lively and interactive as possible. So feel free to pose your questions, notify if you want to ask a question in the chat. With that, let me hand over to Pascal Lamy with a short introductory statement on the question, on balance, is it a cause for celebration, China's membership in the WTO? Over to you, Pascal.
Thanks very much for the invitation. And my answer will be roughly the same as yours a few minutes ago. Was China's accession a success? Yes, but. Typical economist answer on the one hand, on the other. On the macro side, yes, indeed, it was a success as expected. The world economy got a boost. China imported what it needed to modernize its economy, equipment, goods, technology. Consumers elsewhere benefited from lower prices with Chinese exports. And Chinese imports grew more rapidly than it exports, as evidenced by the numbers, and the numbers need to be respected and attended. China's external trade surplus shrunk from roughly 10% of GNP to 1% during the last 15 years. So a clear case of win-win. Now, where is the but? The but is on the micro side, where the picture, I think, is more nuanced for several reasons, which we probably will discuss during this webinar. First, more winners than losers overall includes different local balances, depending on how countries managed this Ricardo Schumpeterian shock. Some did well, others did not. That's not a problem for WTO or for China, depends on the countries themselves. Second reason is that China has changed course 10 years ago in regrowing its state-owned sector, which is very poorly disciplined by WTO rules, which are weak on state aids, hence a lack of fairness in competition and of reciprocity. And finally, more recently, this dual circulation theory, which is at least in part a reaction to the US, Trump and Biden decoupling strategy, which could mean that China will be closing down in the future. So a risk of further unleveling of the playing field. So it's not just China, WTO, it's China, WTO, the US, and the rest of the world. Over to you, Mikko.
Thank you, Pascal, for that initial statement. And indeed, I think you pointed very sharply to the challenges, but also starting with the assessment that things have had positive effects both for China and the rest of the world. Over to Audrey. You have a long-term perspective on this issue, as has Pascal and has Joerg, but I would love to hear from your perspective. What do you think about that?
Thanks, Mikko, and thanks for having me today. Yeah, the question's a good one, and you pose it at the right time. I think, you know, like others, like yourself and Mr. Lamy, good things have happened. Yes, a lot of people came out of poverty, a lot of wealth was created. I think we learned a lot about China in this period and its system and how it interfaces with our systems, which is important to know because in trade negotiations, the devil is always in the detail. I think we also learned on the flip side that China really doesn't intend to become a true market economy. where markets and not governments determine price. And I think that drives economic relations. International agreements, we also learned, have their limits. And I think it's very difficult when we look at the recent joint statement initiative on domestic regulation for services. What I see is a lot of wiggle room language in there that will be taken advantage of by countries who seek to have systems that are more difficult to navigate. So I think our international agreements are just very difficult to come by in ways that are truly enforceable. Hindsight is always 20/20, but if we look at the accession agreement from start to finish of China, it's really the key areas are very weak, if existent at all. On as Pascal said, on subsidies or state aids, there's we still rely on the agreement on subsidies, and there's not much in there on subsidies in the accession agreement that built on that. So we have some weakness there. We have very weak language on state enterprises, as we do in the WTO or in the original GATT. On technology and technology transfer, we have language that if we were going to litigate it, we would have done it a long time ago, right? When we brought the phase 1 agreement, we looked for WTO cases and we found one. It was one that was sort of just one statute or one law of China. It was actually a regulation that we could find that would fit into this paradigm we were looking at of technology transfer. Why? Because it's almost impossible to litigate vague language and win in the WTO. We did because we had a good case, but and also in litigation, in international litigation, the remedies don't fit the crimes. You often punish the wrong people. So it's difficult if a government is not willing to use the system to mutually, kind of in a mutually beneficial way to change things that are truly protectionist. And that's the bedrock of the WTO. You have to have that true goodwill, not paying lip service to it. Finally, I would say that the WTO agreements themselves, not just China's accession agreement, are basically based on a goods agreement, the GATT. We didn't get the ITO, the International Trade Organization, in the 40s. And I'll poke a little bit here at Joerg. Why? Because business lobbied against it. They didn't want guardrails. So what we ended up with some guardrails on governments, but we didn't end up with guardrails on anybody else. And those are the people, that create commercial wealth. Governments should stand back and regulate when they have to. But if the guys that are doing the commercial activity are doing it in ways that can kind of undermine the very agreements that they support, or the principles behind the very agreements they support, we end up in a place we are now, which is we have to rethink. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. You're building a bridge for the next part of the conversation, the rethinking part. But now handing over to Joerg, from your perspective, having lived in China for a long time and having survived the WTO agreement very well, I think, for the past 20 years. How do you look at this?
Well, thank you, Mikko, and I'm very happy to be Radio Beijing today. First of all, I would like to congratulate Audrey for her background. This fireside looks more fitting my time zone. I'm very envious of that. And I would really like to stress that without Pascal, I would not be here, because I'm chairman of an organization that he inspired in 1999 when he was commissioner. He came over to Beijing and says, I don't want to meet the Italians and French and Germans. I want to meet insurance and petrochemicals and cosmetics. And we looked around and thought, that's a cool setting, let's do this. And we decided to come up with a chamber which was complementary to the trade promotion chambers the Germans and the French had. So really, he's the instigator and the initiator of this chamber, which started with 50 members, and we are now 1,700 members. So even if WTO didn't change much in China, but you changed a lot here. So thank you very much. Let me also say that I guess when you talked about a score, I think you mentioned a score and then you mentioned the score. I think just CCTV in its trademark just took the first part out and said, oh, it's a score, you know. And I fully agree with you, what you said. I mean, there has been definitely progress. When I joined my company here, BSF, at that time, it was around about less than $1 billion a turnover in China. Now we're way beyond 11. And we have a $10 billion project under construction, something that would not have been possible without China's accession to WTO and the kind of success it generated, the kind of demand it generated, the kind of ability to export, and the demand for chemicals, which by 2030 will be half of the global production of chemicals will be in China. But also not only the size of business has increased, but also the size of the position paper we produce. As you know, annually in September, we come up with our Bible, and it turns out to be now 430 pages and, hold your breath, 930 recommendations for the Chinese organizations only. I was very privileged to actually meet the Minister of Commerce, Wang Wentao, in October. Privilege being that I was the first foreigner to meet the Minister of Commerce in this year, which already in itself is very telling. That there's a bit of lack of engagement with outsiders, but he was very gracious. And I must say, we had instead 60, 90 minutes, and he really dissected the position paper. So there are serious people in this government. There are serious reformers still available. And again, when you look at the big picture, apparently also from outside China, you see more the deals and the actions of the security apparatus, China closing in and so forth. But believe me, there are good people here still that believe change is necessary, and the demand story has to be enhanced by reforms and not just throwing money at the problem. Now look at 1999, 2000, the lead up to WTO. It was really a window of opportunity. We were lucky to have Clinton in the White House, and we were lucky to have Zhongji in Zhongnanhai. Just imagine today, or imagine even 2 years ago, with this combination of Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, I think hardly ever anything could have happened. So we were very lucky, and it was a good moment of history that actually Bismarck was saying that if history passes by, you have to grasp its code and go with along it. And I guess that's what had happened. Zhongji really pushed it through. And I get very nostalgic when I look at what was decided and what was discussed at that time. Zhongji used the outside forces of the likes of, Charlie Blaszewski and Pascal demanding change in order to actually rule in his interest groups and create change. And it was very interesting at that time. Really, there was a policy discussion going on. I remember endless publications against WTO and GATT. And the prime minister had to deal with this. He had to actually deal with a policy discussion. There is no such thing today anymore. This is an echo chamber we have in this city. And what a difference 20 years make. So in a way, it was a lucky moment for all of us. And yes, we wanted WTO, China to enter it, and we're glad it did. Actually, it was one of these fleeting moments in history when actually that was possible. Because when you look at recent attempts of China, RCEP, or if you look at the investment agreement between Europe and China, I mean, timid is not even the word for it. Yes, we were happy to have Kai, because after 7 years, waiting was really not an option anymore. And we actually were also very disappointed that it survived for 12 weeks and then was shot down by supersized sanctions from the Chinese side. And frankly, my location for the Kai is somewhere between the ICU and the morgue. So I'm not sure it's going to go in the right direction. Which is a great pity. Again, a lost opportunity for China to use outside forces in order to make an inside difference for the better good of the Chinese economy. Reforms from Zhongji is definitely something which was unique. Many reforms still went on after this, also to do with Vice Premier Wu at that time. And then it's after the crisis 2008, 2009, the global financial crisis. I think that's when the West lost its allure and China lost its respect for the West. And that's when they said, oh, we can do better. And we do it our way. And then, of course, Brexit and Trump and all the other things that happened didn't really support the standing of the West as a model for economic reform. And China believed that it's on a good way, and that might actually explain why there's such a hubris in the city. We can do better. The West goes down and the East is rising. It's a great pity. And China's now not in reform mode, but it's in re-format mode. The president is trying to do social engineering and not really opening up the economy. So there we are. Policy discussion is not really happening. We have an echo chamber again, and I'm not sure it's going to go better. But again, it's very good to have China in WTO. It was worth it. We benefited, and here I end.
Thank you, Joerg. And I think lots of things to get a bit deeper into that. I want to congratulate and laud Pascal for responding to questions in the chat and Q&A already. That's very diligent here. Thank you so much for that. Can I pose a question to Audrey that Pascal already responded to, which is about the question, is China playing by the rules of the WTO? Pascal was very forceful in saying, well, no, China is playing by the rules to a large extent, but rules are vague. So would love to hear maybe a quick comment from your side to what extent you think China is and has been playing by the rules.
It's always yes or no, yes and no with China. Is China transparently notifying its subsidies to the WTO? No, that's a requirement, and they're not. If you litigated that matter, you would get some more notifications. It wouldn't fix the problem. And those are the kind of things I think when Pascal says it's too vague, yeah, that's the problem. Even direct language, sometimes China doesn't abide by. And then all the vague language, it can work around. So yes, in many ways, China's abiding by the WTO. The problem with the WTO is it doesn't actually clearly, or if at all, address the issues of today. The kind of state enterprise issues, you could basically say the language is non-existent. Technology transfer, that's what led to the phase one, because the WTO doesn't address it. That's what Section 301 is for, is things that international agreements don't address. And so, basically the WTO doesn't have provisions in areas that it needs to have, and it's just empty in many ways.
That's a perfect bridge for me to get back to Pascal. And by the way, we're still trying to get Alicia on board, stuck in a taxi in Malta. But Pascal, can I get your assessment of the big question in the room here, which is on the issues that really matter with regard to market distortions in China as we move forward, and in light of what Joerg has just said, the current leadership being more interested in not in reform, but in reformatting the system in a way that puts it in a different direction. What are the big issues that we need to tackle? And is there a chance that we can actually tackle them with China? So is there a possibility for joint rulemaking with China on these issues? Now I'm worried that we've lost Pascal along the way. Is that the case? Yes, indeed. I hope he will be joining in a second again. And in the meantime, I would like to continue with this, basically the similar question to you, Audrey, if I may. If you could just continue with the question, do you expect China to abide by rules on issues that you've just mentioned, SOE disciplines, tech transfer, IP protection, etc.? Is there a chance that we can get to the table with them, and under which conditions?
It's, you never say no, because it's always good to remain hopeful that the second largest economy in the world will really play ball. How we get them into that position isn't, I don't think, by quote unquote pushing them. It has to be through real negotiation, and it may be that we have to have our own rules, domestically even, that take a period of years to work themselves into people's psyche, into people's thinking, and then later use those rules to create a framework within the WTO that actually is the bedrock for why China decides itself to change. But I don't think we can start by pushing China to change in some kind of direct way. We did that in the 301 investigation, and we did it in a I think, Ambassador Lighthizer did an excellent job of putting China in the place he needed, which was, I'm going to negotiate with China myself directly. I'm not going to delegate to all the masses. We were definitely staffers of the, staffer variety. And he sat there himself and made sure that he understood what he was going to tell the president the next moment after leaving the room. And so we could very quickly have a negotiation with China, but on all these important issues that we all know what they are and what the details of them are, China walked away from the table. It was on paper, it was pretty good. Was it perfect? No, nothing's ever perfect, but it was really quite good. And China looked at it, finally, somebody did, and said, whoa, this is everything we always promised never to give away. And so, if you can't do it in a 301 setting, I don't know how you do it in a 164 country setting, unless you really approach it from give it a 10-year time frame where you do things unilaterally, if you will, or do things under own domestic law, like the European Union is thinking of with its anti-coercion and anti-subsidy regulations. If those kinds of instruments start to have bite, China will have to react. If many countries do those kinds of things, China will have to react, and there will be sort of a natural coalition that develops around which a framework will emerge. But if we're impatient and try again and again to do what we did or do some version of what we did in the 301 case, I think we're likely to each be met with poor outcomes.
Thanks, Audrey, and we're still waiting for Pascal to come back. I hope he has not been shut out by the Zoom system here for whatever reason. But I have a follow-up question for Joerg, and then I think we also should go into Q&A with the audience until we get Pascal back. So you sitting in Beijing, obviously there's a lot of talk about WTO reform being stuck and that multilateral system not working properly, or the idea of like-minded coordination on setting rules that would then force upward convergence to some extent, at least on the Chinese side. What is it that you actually need? So, I mean, we can make a lot of noises in policy circles about multilateral rules and all of that, but what are the issues that you're really worried about in terms of conducting business as we move forward? And what's the possibility of discussing these and getting getting improvements with the Chinese side? Thank you. Good to have you back, Pascal, by the way.
Let me first state that, did China accept this? Well, China did accept the WTO rules with Chinese characteristics and treated it more like a buffet than rather like a three-course where it actually could sort of follow this. That's actually, it had its benefits, but at the same time losing out a lot of stuff and disappointing expectations that were in our community. And then, of course, the question I always get is, give me an idea how we can change China. When Clinton talked about the change the internet will do to China, he had no clue that China will change the internet. And the same is when in Germany, politicians talked about Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. They had no idea that actually, as you pointed out in the beginning, China's going to change us. We all of a sudden now discuss industrial policy. We talk about investment screening, anti-coercion. I mean, that is quite amazing, something I'm growing up here with. So it is in a way something that I always try to say, we have to be very humble about the ability of the West or Europe in particular to change China. The only thing we can really change is ourselves. And that's where we have to find the kind of development of China, the kind of growth, the kind of success they have, and use it as a Sputnik moment in order to sort out our own deficiencies and not come as a beggar to Beijing and ask for change. China only reacts to a position of strength, and we have lost that in many ways. Still, they're open for foreign business. They are open for foreign engagement, but again, cherry picking is the word. For the foreign community, again, this is very disappointing. And again, we have just published a paper in September, the position paper talking about self-reliance, the danger we see that China turns inward, insular in so many ways. And we have outlined the discussion there. And the interesting part of this paper is that we have a World Bank study in there that shows clearly that if China has three options, one is total reform, the other one is muddling through, basically doing what they've done the last 20 years, and the other one is turning self-reliant. They start from $16,800 per capita PPP to about 36,000 in the medium case. But the difference between best case reform and opening up and self-reliance in 2050 is going to be a cool 22,000 US dollars. So if China chooses herself to go down the route of self-reliance, they pay for it. And this is something we actually are trying to point out. We don't like it. We like more business and more engagement of China. But if China changes direction, they have to know that actually at the end, they're the ones who pay for it.
Thanks, Joerg. And I want to invite participants to raise hands and pose questions, and then we will call on you to put them directly here in this conversation. But so just a heads up. Before that, I want to turn to Pascal. Great to have you back, by the way, with two interrelated questions. One is, what is the future of rulemaking with China in trade? It's a big one, I understand, but maybe let me rephrase it a little bit. Will what we need to be doing to face the market distortions that continue to be emanating from China happen inside the WTO in a like-minded setup or in a bilateral setup? Probably a mix of all of that, but I look forward to your response.
I think we need two things. One, that China realizes that if the rules of WTO are not improved in some disciplines which China is resisting, then trade with China will not be as open in the future as it was in the past. There is a disproportion between the size of China and their resistance or inactivity in WTO to update the rulebook. That's the number one condition. The number two condition is that we need the US to be back to WTO. Let's be frank, the US are absent from WTO. They behave as if either of two things. Either they believe WTO will never discipline China, so why invest political capital with a relatively protectionist domestic opinion? Why would the president spend political capital for something that will not work, given that he has very little political capital to spend on trade? Or, and that was the Trump theory, and it might still be the Biden theory, the rules of WTO prevent US from hurting China trade-wise the way the US want to do it. And that's the second explanation, which of course is much more worrying than the first one.
Thank you. And I will now start channeling questions from the audience, but also inviting them where feasible to pose those questions directly. And I want to start here in this list of the Q&A, but also feel free to raise your hands if you want to. First in line here is Reinhard Bütikofer from the European Parliament, Green Party. And if you want to come in, you can ask your question directly. Otherwise, I'm happy to channel it for you. There you go. So maybe I'll just try here directly. Oh, there you go. Reinhard, over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mikko. My question pertains to this perennial conversation around the levels of dependency, economic dependency that we have developed in Europe on China, narrowing our policy options vis-a-vis China to a degree where we just have to take what we get. I recall the Chancellor arguing in favor of CAI by saying that we have to take what we get now because 5 years from now we wouldn't get it. I would like to ask the experts how they view this theory of dependency, or that reality maybe of dependency.
And that's a question to everyone. I don't know, Pascal, Joerg, you want to take over?
Well, very briefly, as far as I'm concerned, this level of dependency is extremely variable, which explains that many countries have a different balance between their geoeconomics and their geopolitics vis-à-vis China. And within the European Union, for instance, we know full well that Germany is much more China dependent than its Western neighbor. That doesn't prevent the EU to try and have a proper EU balance between economics and politics, but it's a tough call. And in the case of the US, clearly for the moment, there is a tendency to sort of have geopolitics superseding geoeconomics, hence this decoupling theory, which has a lot of support across the US political spectrum. It's clearly different within the European Union. Over to you.
Thank you, Pascal. And I'm looking at Joerg, but I see that we can move on, I think, with the next question. That is Ram Etwaria. Please feel free to come in here with your question. In the meantime, I'm also channeling another one and welcome Alicia to this panel. Jean-Raphaël Petrenier is asking the question, does the time has come to transform the WTO into a better organization, whatever that means, able to deal with countries like China and its practices that are contrary to free trade? I mean, I think we all agree that the need for WTO reform is established. The question is how we get there. So maybe one of you wants to respond to that question, but
maybe Mikko, I have to jump in when someone from Heidelberg is making a statement. Me as a Heidelberger, I have to respond.
Yes.
Reinhard, yes, there is a certain dependency, but 10% of, I guess, European exports are going into China. So it is rather moderate in a way. And it's the genius of the Chinese to always make you feel like that actually they are far more important than the size of the economy suggests. For example, I mean, we are selling 500 million euro into China every day, whereas China sells 1.1 billion euro into the European Union. And 5 years ago, we sold more into Switzerland than into China. That tells you something about trade flows. Of course, I mean, the car industry, the investment comes on top of that. But many people mix this up and assume that's the same thing. Of course, we are heavily dependent as the German car industry. 40, 35, 50% even of the market is going to be here. But that is not really the whole marketplace everywhere. We like to be here, but at the same time, we are not dependent. At the same time, 40% of technology entering China comes from the European Union. And you wonder who is dependent. Again, the genius of Chinese propaganda makes you look like, you are dependent on China. Look at the semiconductor production line about chemicals, machineries, and so forth. China is dependent by 99% on 5 countries only. Yes, we are dependent. We are dependent on masks, and we are dependent on pharmaceutical precursors, APIs, but that's a different matter. I think we just have to look at reality in order to see that actually we have the high ground and it's not Beijing, and we have to negotiate from a very different perspective. Now on the KAI, I've been negotiating multi-billion-dollar projects here for ages, and I can tell you baby steps is the biggest you can achieve. 7 years, it's nearly biblical, of negotiations, this KAI, and out came a very thin soup, but at least there was some sort of nutrition in there, not perfect. And I can assure you another 7 years would have not enriched this nutrition, whatever. China is not in the mode of giving at this stage. And again, shall we keep knocking another 7 years at the door? Or shall we basically say, okay, we have a bit of water with some taste in there and take it away? But anyhow, it's totally theoretical because China, with a supersized sanction, shot it down in the first place.
Thanks, Joerg. Perfect. I hope this response is satisfactory to Reinhard. And I hand over to Ram. Over to you for your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Greetings to you all from Switzerland. I have a very simple question, and it takes along what Pascal Lamy just said earlier about decoupling. And he said that there's a lot of support of decoupling idea in the US. My question would be, what would the world look like today, economically speaking, if China was not in the WTO? Can any one of you think of the scenario where China is not in the WTO, is not a major actor in trade?
Happy to channel this question to the wider panel here. I don't have any urgent questions from the audience apart from the Q&A, so I will pose another one to Audrey here because I think it's quite pertinent. How do you assess the risk of autonomous measures actually weakening the WTO system? I want to combine it with a question around the trilateral US, Japan, and European Union cooperation on issues related to China. What your perspective on the relevance of that is, and to what extent it weakens or strengthens the WTO system as we move forward. So that's for you. If anyone else wants to respond to the question by Ram, imagine a world without the WTO, which is probably more likely as we move forward than in the past. I would like to listen to these responses. So Audrey, maybe first over to you.
Just real quickly to Ram's question, I think China outside the WTO would just mean that we would trade with China on different terms. It may actually, the terms may be easier because we're not bound by the obligations, or we would not be bound by the obligations we would have. But yet, commerce would still be going on. So I think, that's something, it went on before and it goes on with other countries not in the WTO. You don't need an international agreement to conduct trade and commerce. I think that I think it's very difficult to have a WTO just revive itself kind of quickly. I think it's going to be a process. I think we should commit to it, but we should also understand that other things need to happen in order for it to be a successful organization with the right rules. Right now, it doesn't have those provisions, and there's no prospect that we could negotiate them at this time. So how do you look at a future in which those rules come to be part of our legal system, our global legal system? I think we, like the CAI and like the bit that we never did, those agreements are, as Joerg has just said, very thin soup. So I think what we've shown is that international agreements, whether they're multilateral, plurilateral, or bilateral even, are very thin. They just, countries don't really fundamentally agree on a lot of this. Even in the trilateral, as interesting as the discussions were, the differences were quite substantial on what kind of subsidies would be red lighted. We didn't get very far at all on technology transfer. We started late. And on state enterprises, with this litigation on public bodies that was the precursor to this discussion, in a way partially unrelated on state enterprises, the public body discussion clouds the very important issues. The WTO worked well when Europe and the United States, basically went drinking every night in some hotel in Geneva, and we figured out what we were going to agree on, and that was our case. It's like mother and father are going to set the rules for the family, and then that's going to be the rules. Okay, that sounds very arrogant, and I don't mean it that way, but what I'm saying is we can't go in different directions, Europe and the United States, and expect the WTO to survive. Same thing happened on zeroing. So in a way, we're responsible ourselves for killing the WTO. And the Airbus case could have been, I call it the Airbus case, but whatever, the Boeing Airbus case was assigned to me billions of years ago, and I gave it away immediately. I said to Charlene Barshevsky, take this case and give it to this really smart person. Like, he's smarter than me. And today, why? Because I knew that an institution like the WTO would never be satisfactory in being able to deal with major economic and political issues that really have to be resolved. And I think that's what we're dealing with China. So I do think that we need even our own we need to agree upon what our own domestic laws are going to say. Europe is ahead of the United States on this. And then we need to have a framework around this among friends, because our democracies rely on these kind of federal, if you want to call them, systems where you have member states or 50 states here, and we rely on special principles to bring us together that our courts actually enforce. What the WTO dispute settlement system cannot enforce those kinds of principles of free commerce. It doesn't, we don't ask it to. Actually, we don't even want it to. We don't want the dispute settlement system to create new rules. We ourselves have to create it. So I say we have to create new rules, each our own, because even our domestic laws are so different. Our domestic systems are so different on these bedrock issues that we have to start at first principles, and nobody ever wants to. We just want to push the button and say, let's make another trade agreement pop out. Let's have the TPP again. We have Democrats in the White House. Let's just push that button. It doesn't work that way, I think, anymore. And I think we have to accept that and work harder at the individual substantive issues, and then figure out what our own domestic laws should say, and then basically bring that into a framework of agreement among friends.
Thanks, Audrey. And I now realize how Pascal was actually able to run the WTO, because he's answering all the questions while we're actually talking. So it's most fascinating. Thank you for that, really. Joerg, can I ask you about China's own rulemaking ambitions? Because that is a quite fascinating development that, just recently we have the latest 5-year plan on China's International Trade Corporation. China joined the RCEP. China is pretending to be willing to join the CPTPP. It is signaling that it wants a regional digital trade pact in Asia. So that is a pretty consistent and somewhat contradictory signal that we get from China about how much it is actually willing to shape rules and integrate. So what do you make of it? How consistent is that? How much do we have to really believe in that trend? And what is the likelihood of actually Beijing delivering on these integration signals that they're sending?
I get the question because Pascal is busy writing, and now I have to fill in the void here. First of all, let me say China has a plan, really. It's in the DNA of the party, it's the DNA of the country. Just yesterday, I launched a new European Chamber report on standards, and we were outlining how China actually has a plan and fulfills the plan, goes into international bodies, trying to find allies, trying to sort of come from a very, very low point. I mean, if you want an area where the US and Europe were cooperating, or at least was positioning themselves as the ones that are setting the standards, that was the area. And China has seen that, if you are a third-tier country, third-tier company, you produce a product. If you're a second-tier company, you produce innovation. And if you're a first-class company, you set standards. And so that's where they are. And again, they have really this edge in order to position themselves globally. But it's very often not in a multilateral setting. That's not in the DNA of the celestial kingdom over here. It's all spoken hub. It's all in the middle is Beijing, and then you have bilateral relationships. For them to think about being able to share is very difficult. They do. That's the genius of being flexible for a period of time, but at the same time, the long game is always very clear. I'm big and you're small. So again, the question I have is, China is actually very honest and open about it. They play it over the counter. And so they have a plan. The question I always have is, why don't we have a plan? Why don't we have the ambition that China has? It doesn't help us to blame China of what they're doing. They do it because we let them do it. And so in a way, it's something where I think we should come up with our own strengths and then have a better positioning in order to have a China that we want to grow, we want to succeed, and we want to work with. But at this stage, it looks like they got a plan, we don't.
Thank you, Joerg. And I think we're getting closer to the end of this session. So I want to try to bundle a few questions or at least close with a round where I ask you, as Europeans, and maybe Audrey, you want to give us some advice sitting in Washington. As Europeans, what do we need to do next? So what is our priority? The KAI is almost dead, as Joerg said recently. We are starting to work more in the transatlantic context. We are hoping for progress on our own offensive trade policy agenda. Is that enough, Pascal? Will we survive global trade distortions on the magnitude of what is coming out of China in the next decade without better rules? Over to you, Pascal, and I'll make the round with recommendations from other colleagues.
Well, first on KAI, I just answered a question on the chat. My own view is that that was a good deal. It wasn't just something Angela Merkel liked because she is German. It was a good deal that roughly was putting the EU on par with the US. Let's be frank, the US investment regime in China, including with concessions that had been done to Trump, was better than the EU one. So it was a sort of catch-up thing, which I think is very welcome. And my own proposal, and I'm not speaking for anybody else than myself, is that each side should apply the KAI unilaterally. After all, why do you need a ratification? It may take a bit of time. There are huge political questions behind this. These sanctions to China for human rights and to the European Parliament for having defended human rights are an issue which, frankly speaking, we cannot just leave aside. It's a very serious issue. So why don't we apply it on both sides? Now, what do we need? First, I 100% agree that we need a serious WTO reform, not only reforming the rule book, but as I'm saying it more and more often, reforming the way the organization works. There is too much power with members and not enough power with the DG and the Secretariat. In this sense, the WTO was a very modern organization before the US stole the key of the court, which they have done, and that better explain why at some stage. If the WTO does not have a strong binding dispute settlement, then we are back to the Middle Ages. Finally, what I think we should all try to do, and I think the EU is not doing that enough, the EU should condition bilateral progress with the US, which is good and necessary, trade in tech and so on, and that's the thing we need to do to open more trade transatlantic, but we should condition this to the US being back to the WTO and, frankly speaking, solving this stupid appellate body problem, which, frankly, if you put 20 people on both sides for a night of work, they will find a solution, in my view.
Brilliant. I think this is exactly the bridge that we needed for Audrey to walk on. I also realized that we have Alicia now on board with the next question. So I want to make sure that you can come in immediately after Audrey, and then we'll wrap up with Joerg for the final word.
Sorry about that, Audrey. Sorry about that, Audrey. I know what you think. Now, let me check that.
It's good. It's all good. We have to talk. Yeah, I feel like the bridge is one of those that when you walk on it, it moves all the time. So we're going to have to find a better bridge, I think. But yeah, I actually think that, you know, this whole worker-oriented thing that's going on here is got to be more about reining in commercial aspirations to, for example, you know, our companies, they don't tell us what's going on because why? They're taking Chinese subsidies and lowering their licensing fees when China tells them to. So I believe that we need, and then they come in our door and say, please tell the Chinese to stop giving out subsidies. It's like our own guys are unleveling the very playing field that they say it's our job to level. And I think we have to change that dynamic because what China is dependent on, just as Joerg said, is our stuff. And that's coming from our guys, our technology. And if they can't get it lawfully, they then find a way to misappropriate it. So I think we have to have domestic laws, EU law, US law, other country laws that say it's unlawful to take subsidies from certain kinds of governments. We need a law that says it's unlawful to lower your licensing fees in commercial negotiations that actually are with governments, right? Governments should not be driving price. Governments should be regulating when and only when necessary. So we need domestic laws because I don't think the US and the EU are going to agree, given our different legal histories, on what exactly this law that says you can't take subsidies from certain kinds of governments that are not market economies. We have to each have our own law and then agree among ourselves that we're going to each get that law by a date certain. So a framework, a cooperation agreement among the US and the EU that institutes we are going to do these things. And I think we will succeed in that way, doing it separately, but doing it at the same time. Same thing for a law that removes governmental immunity when governments fix prices. What happened, if you look at the export restraints case, that she's brilliant, Catherine Tai won a great case, right? And she deserves to be USTR, and she's a great colleague when I worked with her. But the problem is she won this case. She stayed up, months and months and months all night. That's what it takes to litigate a WTO case. And then what happened? China lost. So now what do we have? We have production quotas instead. So China moves to something that would violate our competition laws, but governments are immune. So China does things that violate competitive market principles all the time, including those things that are actually in our laws, yours and ours, but governments don't get held to account. So we need to change our laws in ways that remove immunity from governmental entities and actors if they do things that are cartels and other forms of monopolistic attempts to monopolize the market. We need these kind of laws. We need the anti-subsidy regulation that Europe's working on, and I think we definitely need some kind of anti-coercion instrument that says, you can't make a joke. Jamie Dimon can't make a joke about, we're going to outlast the Communist Party without turning around and apologizing. We need to change the dynamic that free speech about commerce is okay. And so we need to be sure that if you write, Taiwan on your airplane because you like Taiwan, you can't be taken to account in China for doing so. There has to be some type of penalty if somebody changes the writing on their plane to accommodate what they think China wants, or what China's basically telling them behind the scenes orally. You gotta take this back. You gotta fix this.
All right.
So we have to change that. Otherwise, how do we live in a democracy?
Thanks. I think, Audrey, there's a perfect ending from your part here. I want to make sure that we listen to Alicia. Finally, we have you on board. Maybe just a quick statement and then over to Joerg to wrap this up. Alicia, thank you for joining.
Thank you, Mikko. Sorry, I'm joining as a participant. I just couldn't make it otherwise. But I just want to say that I quite agree with this idea of making sure that we're not undermining our own system by having our companies accepting subsidies elsewhere, let alone others using subsidies to gain market access in Europe. So basically my point is very clear. I don't think the WTO reform that China may be envisaging, if any, will take into account the issues that we just mentioned. And therefore, I do think that we're in an impasse here and we need to think differently. We need to think, as Audrey said, national regulation and moving forward.
Thank you. I think we were fully on track with that. The rethink certainly has led to more autonomous measures being drafted and contemplated all across the world. Final word goes to Radio Beijing. Back to Joerg, and then we can wrap up here.
Well, what can I say after Audrey said it all, basically? Let me just add another dimension besides trade, where China still is in the belief that they know better. They had this great success story that actually blurs their sense of realism, I guess, and go to something where we, US and Europe and China, have something where we could work together, and which is climate change and biodiversity. It's something where definitely China recognizes the advantages that Europe has and the skills that Europe has. I would say we can't change China much on the trade side. We have to do our homework. We have to have our own plan. We have to be clairvoyant of what China does to us. But at the same time, we have a strength and we have something where we can actually work with China, because after all, climate change has no borders.
Thank you, Joerg, for that positive note. I think we all agree on that, despite the fact that maybe CBAM and other issues we could have touched upon might play a role in actually getting that bridge right between climate change and trade policy. But anyway, I want to thank you for a fantastic panel. Great to have you all on board. Thank you so much for spending your time with us this morning, afternoon, and evening indeed. Have a good weekend. Thanks to the audience for joining us today. Thanks for brilliant questions. And we look very much forward to being in touch with you. See you. Thank you.
Good night.